Testing.
Well, good morning again. I want to thank you and welcome you to what is going to be a fantastic hour ahead of us, because of these three young men are going to share their experiential experience about the topic of, I would say the last year, but it's probably been the last 20 years, but everybody's top of mind when you speak about AI. And when I say we have thought leaders, we do have thought leaders that are here today. So a couple of more housekeeping for those who came in late. You got easy access to the men's and women's facilities right behind you. We have water to your left. We have breakfast tacos and mostly healthy fruit and some not as healthy snacks. Feel free to, again, this will be casual, but very highly informative. And I'll let, we want to thank Hush Blackwell, one of the leading healthcare firms, not only in the capital city, but across the country. And we've got a rising star who will lead and guide the conversations today with our two esteemed colleagues and thought leaders, with Ganesh and Charlie. So I'll turn it over to Adam and he'll open it up. And one quick note, at the end we will have Q&A. And since this is a AI themed event, we have an AI microphone, meaning the speaker. So it is a question microphone. So at the end, if you don't ask a question within 20 seconds, it's going to shut off. So I want to let you know, questions, not statements. It's not a statement time, it's a question time. Thank you.
Thanks, Seth. Can everybody hear me with the mic? All right, cool. I'm Adam Royal. I'm from Hush Blackwell. Like Seth said, Hush Blackwell is the sponsor today. Just a little bit about the firm. We've got over 1,000 lawyers in over 20 cities across the United States. We're a full-service firm, specialize in all kinds of industries, and help clients from global leaders to startups. We have a strong presence in healthcare and have been ranked the #1 healthcare practice by the ABA for the last 2 years. A large concentration of our healthcare practices in here in Austin. We have some in Dallas, some in California as well. And we help healthcare clients kind of across the spectrum. I practice specifically corporate and M&A for healthcare entities, so start from formation all the way to divestitures and acquisitions. So it's a little bit about me and the firm. Our two speakers today, Ganesh Padmanabhan, the CEO and founder of Autonomize AI. You got that right. Thank you. A technology company transforming healthcare knowledge workflows with AI agents and co-pilots. He's a seasoned business leader, entrepreneur, and investor, and has deep expertise in data and AI. He's passionate about the use of technology to tackle humanity's biggest challenges and believes in the power of AI to augment human potential. He also founded Stories in AI, a podcast and an edutainment platform that explores the transformative impact of AI through storytelling. In addition to leading Autonomize AI, Ganesh is an investor and advisor for multiple startups and an active mentor in Austin, Texas. A frequent keynote speaker, he's been featured on Forbes, Business Insider, Fast Company, and other leading publications. And then Charles Taylor, one of the foremost experts in computational science and its application in the practice of medicine. His research on the use of artificial intelligence and computational methods has transformed the practice of cardiology and given rise to the field of predictive simulation-based medicine. He's the co-founder of HeartFlow, where he developed a non-invasive tool that uses imaging to simulate and assess blood flow through coronary arteries, the first AI-enabled technology to be included in cardiology clinical practice guidelines. In 2023, NEJM AI recognized it as the most widely adopted AI technology in US healthcare, and he's now a professor at UT. So a lot of expertise here on AI and healthcare. To get us started, if y'all could both give maybe a little bit more background about yourselves, what you're doing now, and kind of where you see the direction of AI going.
Okay. Hello, good morning, everyone. Sorry to keep everybody waiting a little bit. I ran a little late. Excited to be here. Thank you so much, and what a pleasure to be on the same stage with Charlie today. So, like Adam mentioned, right? I'm CEO founder of Autonomize AI, and what we're really trying to solve is, look, healthcare for the last 10 to 15 years, digital health, health IT, health tech has really exploded. But if I ask you, has healthcare gotten better or worse in the last 10 years? Most people would argue it's probably gotten at least status quo, or at best, gotten worse. And the reason for that is the way we solve problems in healthcare has been incentivized to solve the easy symptomatic problems that are siloed, and then you create these islands of efficiencies that doesn't translate into compounded value across the entire health enterprise, right? So that's what we're really trying to solve. We believe the fundamental, the most critical aspect of the healthcare ecosystem is actually the knowledge workers, the doctors, the nurses, the physicians, the caregivers, the researchers. So what we give them is actually tools and capabilities to give them, and I like to say that we give them a Jarvis suit to make them from Tony Stark to Iron Man, right? That's what we do. So excited to be here to talk more about AI.
Nice to meet everybody today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. It's a really interesting topic. When I was first asked to talk about this, I'm not a lawyer. It's hard to talk about law, for instance, related to AI per se, but actually have spent a lot of time thinking about that from the time I was on faculty at Stanford, spent 14 years as a professor in medical school and engineering school, and then had this idea, just looked at what was going on in cardiology and I remember there was a particular time where there's a group of physicians coming into the hospital, and there's a physician who talked about his patient. He said, this is what I did in 1992, this is what I did in 93, then in 96 the patient came back, I did this. I thought, oh my God, this is crazy. It's really so much of a trial and error process deciding how to treat patients with cardiovascular disease. And I had come from an engineering background and thought maybe there's a better way to actually plan treatments for patients with heart disease, to actually use computing, predicting outcomes for interventions, and then using that to guide treatment strategies. So again, spent 14 years at Stanford building some of the core technology, spun it out in 2010 into HeartFlow, together with my colleague, longtime colleague at Stanford, a surgeon, vascular surgeon, and started the company. And with the goal, the problem that I was trying to solve, I was looking at cardiology and how heart disease was diagnosed. And it probably will shock many of you, but I'll give you an example. Visiting a large healthcare system in the South, and I went there and they talked about their tests, their diagnostic tests that they were using to diagnose heart disease non-invasively, and they referred to it as a coin flip test. That's how they referred to it. That was the level of confidence they had in it. And I said, well, how often do you do it? 1,000 times a month. I thought, that's crazy. You know, it just the status quo in cardiology was so poor at diagnosing cardiovascular disease. So the consequence, people were doing the tests because they felt that they had to do a test, right? If you have a patient who's symptomatic, you do a test, and then the test is wrong, you blame it on the test. If you don't do a test, then it's the doctor's fault, right? And they haven't done something perhaps what they need to do. So I looked at that and I said, you know, there's got to be a better way, and it started with directly visualizing the coronary arteries with CT scan, and then actually using AI and built an entire human-in-the-loop AI system to go from images to, you know, very detailed, very accurate models of the coronary arteries in areas of disease, and took a field from, you know, false positive rate of 50%, false negative rate of 20%, to, you know, now HeartFlow has, you know, reported false positive, false negative rates from customers that are a fraction of a percent, less than 0.5%. And it's now in clinical practice guidelines. But I went all the way through regulatory clearance, 4 years, started the company in 2010, raised a whole bunch of money, missed our first regulatory clearance trial with the FDA, missed the primary endpoint, had to redo it, got clearance in 2014, and then, you know, clearance doesn't come with a check. You have to go out and basically get, you know, you have a right to market a product, but you're not getting paid for it. So you have to navigate the complex healthcare payment systems in the United States, which means Medicare, private insurers, Medicaid as well, so you can cover the whole population. And that was another 4 years before we got Medicare payment, and then 3 years, you know, by the way, once you get Medicare payment, if anybody understands this, there's national Medicare. You can have national Washington Medicare say, you know, you're good, this is how much we're going to pay you. And our test, where image data would come to us, we would process it, send a result back, a computer model, patient's coronary arteries. They said, we'll pay for it $1,450, or no, $1,450. And great, but there's 7 different Medicare administrators in the country that you have to then localize your payment to. It's insane. And then you deal with that, and then you get through, then you have prior authorization issues, right? I mean, I'm sure all of you have dealt with that as patients, where you say, I want to get this test for an advanced imaging study. Then you have to have that cardiologist has to call up, you know, a radiology benefits manager, you know, often maybe talk to a podiatrist and tell them why you need to use this test for a patient with heart disease. Then you get through that process, and the insurance companies are trying to make it as difficult as possible. You get through that, and then you can get paid, you can get ordered. So went through, navigated all of that, then got into clinical practice guidelines, and a few years ago in cardiology. So that made a big difference. And then I after doing that for 13 years, I thought it's time to start to look at another problem. Felt like I'd beat that one to death. And I came to University of Texas just to advise the dean and the president, and she said, how about if you come here, we're building a new hospital, and help me, you know, integrate technology into the hospital. So a little background of the story, but really interesting legal issues related to all this. I'm sure we'll have time to talk about.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Ganesh. So before we get kind of into the legal issues and the regulatory hurdles, just kind of want to level set, kind of big picture, AI in healthcare, where we're at, where you see it going. So as you sit here today, what do you think are the most promising applications for AI in healthcare, and specifically addressing kind of patient care and diagnosis? And Ganesh, I think you spoke a little bit about this in your intro.
Yeah, so look, I think we're still in the early innings of healthcare and AI, right? And I think there's fundamental themes that, you know, I see from where I'm at. And I think one is the part of AI that really works right now is still the human-in-the-loop AI. How do you empower the folks who already have the contextual knowledge of how to treat patients better? You remove their admin burden so they don't have to go call that radiologist and get the podiatric specialty recommendation on the heart disease. All of that stuff, you take that off their plate, they can spend time with patients. So that's one aspect of it. Like reducing admin burden is a big theme, and there's a lot of what we focus on Autonomize as well. So for health plans and health systems, it's like, look, how do you make we're not trying to automate away the complex processes, but we're trying to make sure that you spend like 1/10 of the time that you take to process that particular thing. That's one, right?
Yep.
I think the other theme that we're seeing is definitely the consumerization of healthcare. So you now have more information as a patient to be better informed. And I had dinner with a friend like last week, and he was telling me there was one of his friend's children had a very rare disease that was never being diagnosed back in India. So the access is a big problem. And it was just impossible for them to find out. They've gone through multiple things. They just almost resigned to this particular thing. They found, I can't remember the name of that for the life of me, but it was a rare disease that they found has a very easy lifestyle fix that you can make and some food that can change the quality of life of the patient. The child is going to be with the disease. But that information was found through a lot of LLM mining and prompt engineering and trying to mine the clinical research documentation that you now don't have to go to ct.gov and ask questions and find out and do the math on, right? How do you parallelize or normalize endpoints across multiple trials before you actually figure out what's best for you? So things like that. So I think there is a trend of, how do you make sure you empower the consumer to be a participant in the care process? Right? I think that's the thing. The third thing, I do think there's the biggest opportunity I see is like healthcare, I believe fundamentally, is more care than health. And the reason is it's that empathy, it's that human factor that actually makes you feel better. And there's a lot of things. I'm also a big proponent of Eastern philosophy and Advaita and stuff like that. So there's a lot of historic and philosophical connotations here, how your mind over body kind of a thing, right? So a lot of what makes us feel better and stuff, and I'm not, the diagnoses are important, all of that stuff, right? But there's a care aspect, that's a human empathy aspect. I think the biggest opportunity we see is having our caregivers and doctors and nurses who are delivering care, like when you take off that admin burden, when you empower them with more information, insights, context, and content, they can actually go back to what they really came into the job to do. Because end of the day, like one last thing I would say, nobody in their right mind in the United States goes into medicine. Just think about it, right? They work long hours. They deal with sick people all the time, right? They're always constantly hearing complaints. They don't have a lifestyle. They come back. They don't spend time with the kids. They do documentation after the day's visits. Their pay is okay. Software engineers today get paid more in Google, right? And still they do it, right? So it's in us, for example, one of the things like how do you empower them to do more? They're all there for that care instead of the health. And I think it's the golden age for healthcare to actually go push and make that happen.
I think those are great points, Ganesh. I agree with you. I think we actually spend more time on sick care than on health care. And we wait too long for patients, we wait till they get really sick. And then we deal with them. We spend a hell of a lot of money, on the process. I'll just give you an example for, what I see in cardiology. There's no reason. Heart disease is the leading cause of death. And it's been that way for a long time. And actually, the rate of people having heart attacks is increasing because of increasing diabetes and obesity. Like, in spite of all of this money we spend, all the technology, and the problem is we're waiting too long. We're waiting till people get sick. Why is that? Because you cannot get paid to do a test until you have symptoms. And you have to go to the physician and say, I have symptoms. And then they talk through that, like, are you really have symptoms? Well, turns out half the people that have heart attacks have never had a presenting symptom, have never described a symptom. So it's easy to solve this problem, actually. We just got to figure out how to invest earlier into screening for heart disease, find it early, treat it when it's less costly than waiting until it gets late. And I have so many stories relate to that. So I think there's AI. First of all, I'm incredibly bullish on the opportunities in AI in healthcare. There are now 1,000 FDA cleared products, 1,000 AI products cleared by the FDA. The challenge is that most of these are not integrated into the healthcare system because they're not getting paid. And I spent a lot of time figuring that out. In the end, it's like we would take an image data set, we would process it with a computer, human loop AI, send a result back, send a virtual model back, and now this is being paid over $1,000 by Medicare, by all private insurance companies. So for a virtual representation of patients' heart in order for physicians to make decisions. So the challenge is you have to prove, it's not just getting clearance. That's the easy part. The hard part is figuring out how to integrate it, and you have to prove clinical value. So I think one of the big things that I see, the companies that will be successful will prove that it's valuable. Will prove that it helps patients, it benefits patients. They're also going to have to prove, perhaps, how it reduces costs. For us, I looked at the way disease was diagnosed, and I said, these tests don't work, the non-invasive tests. So it was happening. Everybody went to an invasive cardiac catheterization lab for a procedure, an invasive diagnostic test. That was negative 80% of the time. So what's wrong with this picture? Why are we waiting so long? Why are we doing these expensive tests? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for AI to actually reduce the cost of healthcare, number one. I think the other, and Ganesh touched on this, patients need to be informed. I'm sorry, I have an example of, a loved one that went to see a cardiologist, she is actually my wife, she doesn't mind me saying that, but, in her 50s, chest pain, symptoms, she couldn't convince the doctor to actually image her coronary arteries. It took me going there as the founder of HeartFlow, and he used my products. And I'm like, what the hell's going on? Why are you being so difficult? So as a patient, you have to advocate for yourself. That is the most important thing that you can do. You need to become knowledgeable, and you have to advocate. And I think what's really exciting in healthcare is that the opportunity, I don't really believe that we're going to have AI is going to replace doctors. Bill Gates said that a couple of weeks ago. Doctors are going to be gone in 10 years. I think that's all BS, to tell you the truth. But the truth is that we as patients should figure out how to use these tools to learn as much as we can, so you can have a conversation with your physicians about what's going on, and you need to get to the best. Sometimes you need to very specifically ask your physician, this is what I know, why are you not doing this test for me? Because the truth of the matter is there's clinical practice guidelines, just people do kind of what they want to do, more or less, and it's often based upon habit. So I think there's tremendous opportunities to bring AI to help empower patients to be more knowledgeable, to have conversations with physicians, and that will result in better care, and I think less expensive care as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. Yeah, Charlie, you mentioned at the end that conversation with the physician and having an informed conversation is key for the patients. In law, in our industry, that patient-physician relationship is key. So is the physician decision-making. That's something we see kind of regulations and courts protecting and focusing on. For decades they have been in various capacities and in response to various developments in society and technology. Ganesh, you mentioned kind of relieving the administrative hassle of healthcare, and AI can do that. And certainly I've seen that in my practice, just the routine things you can kind of farm out to AI. But there's kind of this tension between what is an administrative burden that could reasonably be kind of dealt with by AI compared to what is kind of the core physician decision-making. What are those things that characterize the practice of medicine, so to speak? And I think that tension is something that from a legal perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and just generally a policy perspective, we're going to have to grapple with as AI gets integrated into healthcare. And so how do you see, as this moves forward, some guideposts or kind of protections around that core physician decision making to make sure that that's protected? Because I agree, I don't think physicians are going away either in the next 10 years or ever. So how can we protect kind of that conversation between physicians and patients while still utilizing AI?
Okay. Charlie lobs it over to me like, why don't you start? Look, I don't have an answer. I'll tell you very honestly, but I think it's a hard problem, right? And I'll tell you why. One, as a human, as a species, we have far exceeded the the capability to consume, understand, comprehend the amount of information that gets produced around us. There's no way. You can try, right? But if you look at atomic capabilities like, looking at an object or a picture and identifying and labeling everything underneath it, looking at language and understanding the nuances of that language, looking at a video and understanding everything that happens at every microsecond in the frames, humans, get beat by really high quality AI that does that today. In every single atomic capabilities, the eyes, the ears, all the senses that we pride ourselves to have, right? So in that world, it's almost the wrong question to ask, saying it's AI versus human. It's almost the framing of the problem should be an AI-assisted human or a human with the AI's assistance. What can they now do that they couldn't do before? So that's one aspect. I'm just giving you some ideas to think about, right?
I fully agree with that, Ganesh. It's an awesome point. Yeah.
Right? And I think, so with that framing in mind, the real practical concerns of this is this, right? I'll give you one practical example of what we do. We help health insurance companies reduce costs so they can increase the access to care and lower the cost of care. One area we focus on is prior authorization, right? And the whole aspect of it's such a painful, unnecessary process. But if you're an insurer, you're trying to underwrite, you're trying to make sure you manage utilization on the one hand, you're also trying to make sure the right person gets the right level of care, because the clinical practice is not perfect, right? People just follow what they already have been used to. So it's like it's a balance, right? You need that because of certain reasons, but it's painfully, problematic. Well, what we help AI assistants to do is that whole process of reading the request form that comes in with all the medical information, checking that against clinical guidelines, making sure you summarize that as it relates to build a checklist for them to go make a quick decision based on the clinical medical necessity guidelines as well as the evidence-based guidelines, so they can go in and say, look, we found all the evidence of what the requirements needed here. So it's 90% there. This last 10%, we couldn't find it. So it's up to you. You just pass that thing to them, and so they can make a decision. Now, if you stretch that, today that's what we do. We give the decision back to that utilization management nurse to make the final call. Simple adjudication, but we've also noticed is, if AI says approve because it meets all the criteria, it's just going to go by the letter of the book, right? So it's an approval. Don't even bother looking at it. But if it says deny, apply a human factor. But in this process, there is a strategic challenge here. Like what we noticed was these nurses, initial days, when they were using this AI, they would second guess everything. They'll go back and check. They'll verify. They'll make sure you have the right thing. The citations are good and stuff. 3 months in, they trusted so much that they just oh yeah, it says it's done. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to check it. Click go. That habitual, or how do I frame it? It's not intentional, but there's a complacence that sets in, right? It's about when you start relying on AI too much, and when it is everywhere around you. And so the bigger question to me is where does the onus lie for a bad decision? Is it in the AI model vendor versus the human in the loop? Or, there's legal reasons we will navigate that using what we do is pass that decision back to the human and saying, it's your call, you're the signing up for it. I'm going to help you be your ears and eyes to make sure that you can do this much quicker. But, that's not going to really solve the access to care problem today, right? So for me, that is the bigger question, where there's a societal side here, we're not even going there, but how do we rewire the way to think about this as a human plus AI, equation, and how do we put the right guardrails in? I have some ideas on that too, but, Charlie, I'd love to hear what you think on that.
That's great. Hey, look, if you can resolve these issues of prior authorization, to take, a physician spending an hour on a call, peer-to-peer call, to try to get authorization for something that is in clinical practice guidelines is crazy. That's not the best use of their time.
There's patients.
Absolutely, and or more time with the one patient. Yeah, I think that would be incredible, and I also feel that, by the way, the process, this radiology benefit management process, this check, it actually could be done in a way that's very constructive, right? If you go back and your physician, has something in there, and you could have a suggestion. Well, what about, have you tried this? Have you tried this other alternative? So payers can have a positive role in this rather than just trying to deny care If the answer is always no, like no, 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 then something's going to happen and we're going to kick the can down the road and the patient's going to have to be dealt with when they're a lot more sick. So figuring out, I think AI has a really important place in helping streamline that process and let doctors be doctors. I think the point about keeping the human loop, I very much believe in that. I've never built a system, HeartFlow as a company is used by thousands of hospitals around the world. Every, like 99% of patients in the United States, live in a region where the technology is accessible to them. But the challenge is that how do you make this easier? How do you make this easier for patients? How do you make it easier, for doctors? And what you can do with respect to kind of payer support, and what has happened, if I was telling you about this, 50%, false positive rate, for instance, the coin flip tests. I'll give you another example. In nuclear cardiology, physicians often refer to, they say, switch the N and the U. It's unclear cardiology. That's doctors talking about this. They don't believe in the technology. So how can we actually move, the field forward? So what has happened actually with most of the payers and the benefit managers is they basically describe this as like payer activism. When you if a physician is trying to order one of those tests, you push back. Say what's often called a soft redirect. You say, how have you considered these other things? And I think that could change a lot. Not every physician is completely up to speed on all the clinical practice guidelines. So getting a suggestion, I think, is really important, but let the doctor be the doctor in the end. I don't believe that this could get abused. The technology could get abused where then patients don't have access to care because the AI doctor says they shouldn't have it. That I think is a slippery slope. And hopefully we can avoid that. But I think there's a lot of possible and positive upsides coming from this.
I think, the point about, look, how do you turn this whole thing about, because physicians don't have time. I love the fact that you turn this whole thing around, let AI be a prompter, just make sure, hey, have you checked this? Have you verified this? So one of the interesting things we learned when we started the company, and my background before this was not necessarily healthcare. I've worked with healthcare companies and worked with several of you here back at Dell and stuff too. But and I think what we learned very quickly is we thought the biggest problem in healthcare was the data being very hard to analyze at scale because there's a lot of data being produced and you had to pair it with the right context. So we thought we could just turn all that data into normalized data sets, give it to somebody in all these different contexts and they can make decisions. What we learned was nobody gave a shit. They don't have the time to give a shit. They don't understand it. They don't have they're so busy in their workflows. So you have to go meet them where they are, which is their workflows. And that's where healthcare things. And so just being that, proactive assistant within their workflows will change the dynamics how we deliver care.
If I could, offer another example about, introducing a technology in healthcare, this point about having the doctor make the decisions. So I brought after this is a fourth product or so, it got cleared by the FDA, but I brought it to a major hospital in the West, and it was to help them make clinical decisions about using it. And the imagers basically said, no, I've read thousands of cases. This is really not going to be helpful. I'll try it out. I said, just try it out. And 90 days later, we had a 90-day trial period, and the physician went to their clinical practice, the administrator, and said, we will no longer read cardiac CT images without this technology, because it found, this is the challenge in medicine. I'll give you an example with all the data that is being generated. There is so much information. There's been estimates like of a heart scan that a physician is able to look at about 5% of the data that's generated. In fact, it's probably a lot less, because you can reconstruct this in all the different ways, and a physician would never do it, would never look at it. But to have a machine to kind of pre-read this and then say to the physician, look here, here, and here, I think is really powerful. Now the question about I think it's a great question to say, so now you have an error. How do you improve upon that? And I struggle with the issue that if we say, well, there's a diagnostic error. What does that mean? Then the AI is at fault. This is the struggle I have, is that we've got to realize as a society that there's absolutely no test on the planet that is perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect diagnosis. It's not possible. So I think we have to look at it through the lens of, is it better than the alternative? Because if we go down the road where we say we're going to, you have a company, it's obviously easy to go after an AI company, a company building the technology, and say now the patient had a poor result. Then you have to say, okay, was it still better? Did you in this uncertain situation get better information that you would have gotten absent using it? And I think we have to reframe our expectations. Healthcare is so complicated, and we'll never be in a position where any technology, any person, any technology will be perfect. So I think the question is it as good as we can make it? Was there, of course, if there was a technological flaw or wasn't tested properly by a company and they went through, then there obviously has to be accountability. But I think we have to reframe our expectations about what is possible in healthcare.
Yeah, I'm interested in that process, Charlie. And Ganesh, you also said with AI and developers and the interaction with healthcare professionals, you have to meet them where they are. I think y'all are both in an excellent position to kind of speak to this question, but between AI developers and healthcare professionals, as the developers are developing AI, what does that coordination with healthcare professionals look like to make sure you're giving them a product that's helpful and also kind of they're allowed to speak into or given an opportunity to speak into that decision making and where errors might occur?
Charlie, you go first.
I was going to offer to. So I think first of all is right. If you look at it through the lens and the framing that I had when I started a company, I started a company because I saw that there was a clinical issue in diagnosis of heart disease that I wanted to solve. And quite frankly, you have to be able to, as somebody who's developing a technology, it's honestly foolish to have and it actually bugs me quite a bit. There's a lot of people where I came from, and I spent the last 30 plus years in Silicon Valley. You have a little bit of this kind of tech hubris here as well in Austin, but that really bugs the hell out of me. Honestly, Bill Gates' statement, Jeffrey Hinton said in 2016 we should no longer train radiologists. There'll be no more in 5 years. It's complete bullshit. And it really bugs me because I think there's a lot of this hubris that people come in from outside medicine and they say we're going to do all these things. And they don't appreciate it. So job number one, if you're working in this area, you have to understand as much as you can about, put yourself in the shoes of physicians, interact with the healthcare professionals. I mean, whether it's doctors or whether people trying to reduce bureaucracy in the system, I think it's critically important. And it's a focus on quality. Focus on trying to provide the best possible care. My experience, by the way, is that, and I brought one of the first AI products through the FDA. And my experience, there was an easy path that I could have taken. If you, by the way, in imaging, you can go, typically everybody manufacturer would know, you go through the radiology branch because there's almost no checks on the technology. They basically don't require manufacturers to do anything because nobody makes any claims. They do all this processing of data, AI, and they don't claim that it can do anything, and they then put it in the hands of physicians. And since there's no claims, the regulatory barriers are very, very low. I chose not to do that. I went to the cardiovascular devices branch, and the result of that is I went through a de novo 510K process with clinical evidence and data, and it was building a great relationship with the regulatory agencies are very important. I think much maligned often, but very important in this process. And because I look at it through the lens, if we have AI technologies that are causing a lot of problems, in healthcare, it's going to poison the well. And I think I'm, quite frankly, very concerned about what's going on at the FDA right now, because I know a lot of the best people there that could leave are leaving. Because, by the way, anybody who knows anything about AI, do you want to be in a position where you're, quite frankly, vilified, for what you're trying to do, or are you going to go work for a tech company? Everybody's leaving. So we are, I think, running into a scenario, by the way, in cardiovascular devices, in that area, about every week there's another product recall. If you follow what's going on, it's almost every single week there's another recall. So what happens if we don't have anybody minding the store? I hope that maybe some of you can help right the ship here, But what happens, we have to have that, right? It is a responsibility of a person building the technology to build a high-quality product. They should care more about the quality of the product than the regulators. But in the end of the day, we have to have some balance here. And I really worry about things coming through a period. Either things are going to get really slow at the FDA, or they're going to go too fast, and we're going to get a lot of products that are going to come out in healthcare that are not going to be safe. And so, again, sorry to get off the soapbox about that, but I think that this intersect between the developers, the clinical practice, regulators, the legal profession is going to be really important in the years to come to make sure that we honestly don't end up in a situation with a lot of very dangerous products coming into healthcare.
No, I 100% agree on that, especially on the regulatory comment. They're an important constituent. There is a reason why they exist, and it's I worry about getting into a Wild West scenario here too. So, but to the question on the intersection of the developers to the clinicians and how do you actually go work together, I'll offer a few practical examples, if you will, right? So one is, look, I mean, you got to get the clinical folks as a part of the development process. And it's very, very, very critical. And it's gotten a lot easier than it was before. When you think about the development of a medical device or a AI software that helps clinician earlier. You write code, you actually get it tested, you make sure it actually works, then you get it to the hand of clinicians, they'll give you feedback, they'll come back to it and stuff. Now with, where AI is and where generative AI is, I think the most disrupted job today is actually that of a software engineer or developer. Because you can now, if you know, at least if you know English, you can write code, right? Or you can create software. So you now have an opportunity to just compress that whole thing, that time between a developer and a clinician to go have that highly iterative process to go do it. We do that a lot at Autonomize when we actually go in and say one of a very critical part of our deployment process at a large health plan or a health system is 60 to 90 day UAT process that you actually go through the user acceptance testing, and we make it a little regimented from a perspective. One is the whole the numbers, the quantitative aspect, and then you have the qualitative aspect where you give them, and what you're really doing is not just the validating and making sure they're actually comfortable, but you're also building trust. Back to my earlier comment on you got to get the human plus AI equation right. It's not so much of human versus AI. And the classic question you get asked is like, oh, is your AI 99.9% accurate? And I'm like, humans are at best 40%, 5% if it's radiology, right? So it is just, but it's a lot of that education. It's about activation. It's getting people back into the thing to understand what it is. And I think we have a long way to go. And clinicians in general in this country don't have time. So how do you go and empower them, educate them? I got to tell you, I think I've been so excited about seeing the level of excitement in physicians, in nurses, in caregivers of late ever since ChatGPT, just to know that they have one more, they have a personal AI counselor to go to, right? I mean, they can ask a question if they don't know, and it's easier than just looking through a binder that every specialist has that's got clinical guidelines, right? It's got 8,000 pages in it, and there's an index in there that helps them which page to go to, but it's not practical, right? So I think there's an element of education and activation. There's an element of trust building with them beyond just the validation aspect. I think those are the two things that we've seen work really well, and I think it's still a lot needs to be done there.
Ganesh, your point with trust really resonates with me. Everybody would come into Harflow that was there. I would say it's about building a trusting relationship. And I said, there's a Dutch proverb which is trust comes in on foot but leaves on horseback. And I would tell everybody your responsibility is like with customers. And I visited thousands of hospitals around the world. And I would say, and you build relationships with physicians. And I would say sometimes these take many years. At first when you introduce a technology like this, they don't know what it's like. They're going to kick the tires. They're going to try it out. They're going to push it as hard as they can push it. But if they have confidence that it works, then once you kind of cross that threshold, then it's your responsibility to maintain it, right? And that in my experience, that's delivering a high quality product that really solves their problem. It makes their lives easier, to helps align the patient with patient benefit with physician challenges. One of the things that's hardest about healthcare, I would say, is I always talk about there's 4 Ps. There's 4 stakeholders. There's the patient, there's the physician, there's the provider. I had to have another way for hospital, right? Provider as a P, and then there's a payer. There's in some systems you have to deal with the politicians too, because as you bring a technology into a healthcare system, then sometimes there's the element of that, trying to get them to help and to be on your side when you introduce something. So it's really hard to align all of these stakeholders. It really is difficult because sometimes things are better for patients. A doctor gets paid more, but it costs more. And then the payers are not happy. Everybody else is happy. So that kind of alignment of interest is something that you always have to think about, aligning stakeholders and figure out how it can be a win for everybody.
And one quick point on alignment, right? When we talk about the human-machine alignment as the big broad topic, we miss the detail that is more critical that we have to solve, which is the alignment of stakeholders and incentives to make sure that the use of AI is getting better, right? So I think it's unfortunate, but I think that is underscoring that point, actually.
I think we have time for one more question before we go to Q&A. And Charlie, this may be asking you to get back on your soapbox a little bit, but on the regulatory side of things, it seems like a lot of this is going to be an issue of first impression for regulators as you kind of submit AI-backed products to them for review. And in my practice, dealing with regulators is slow, and with new issues can often involve some education if they haven't confronted it yet. And so in your experience in that regulatory process, do you have any tips or experience from the educational aspect with the regulators of how do you work with these regulators when you're trying to get something approved that they're not used to seeing and the regulations don't really?
I think it's the same thing I was talking about interacting with physicians. It's trust. It's building trust. And I would go to regulators. I'd say, I'm going to care more. I promise you, I will care more about the quality of my product than you do. And I always felt that was the truth. But if you meet them, because if you go to a regulator, do they have any benefit if they get a product through quicker? Not really. But is there a downside if something goes through and has to be recalled that was on their watch? There's a big downside. So obviously having the conversation, helping them understand why this is good for patients, for example, and then starting to build a relationship where obviously you're not their buddies, right? When you're visiting the FDA and talking to them, but if you're very open, honest, transparent, by the way, I also feel this way with my interactions with physicians. I'll go to physicians and I'll say, if you see something wrong, please complain about my product. Like, complain about our product, because that's how we'll get better. That's how we'll learn. But if you build it sounds a little crazy, right, doing that. But if you go in there with some modesty and say, look, we know this is not perfect. This is what we think we can do and how we can help patients. And you approach the regulators in that regard, and they're trying to help you. You need them to help you get this product into the healthcare system. And to be able to figure out how to make that happen. My experience, again, I have a lot of respect for the people that work at the FDA. I mean, there's some of the people that have made a lot of sacrifices to be able to go into that profession, and they're in there. Many people that I know are in there because they want to be part of improving healthcare and help making sure that we bring products forward into healthcare that are better for patients. So I think when you have that, build the trust. And by the way, you can lose it really fast there, right? If you take a shortcut, you skip some steps, you're dishonest with the regulator, you're going to lose that trust overnight, and it'll be impossible to get it back. But I think it's that relationship, the same way you would interact with a physician, interact with the regulators in that way.
Yeah, viewing that as collaborative, not us versus them, but we're both trying to get this through and in the best way.
Yeah, and I've been in a lot of situations before I started HeartFlow, where I often go to the FDA with other companies, and often it was like, how little can we say to the FDA? Yeah. Like, how little information can we disclose? My experience, that's not a good path to take. Because they're going to smell it a mile away that you're holding back on information, you're not disclosing them. But if you go in there and say, look, this is what we know about our product, this is the data that we have, then I think you can build a trusting relationship that goes a long way.
I think that's a great point. Ganesh?
I have not a lot to contribute there, but except like budget a lot of time, because there's a lot of education, there's a lot of getting them along that, like I said, but I think trust, I mean, can't underscore that point. It's all about just building it.
I want to make one other point about this, because I'll tell you about what's some of the changing regulatory dynamics. There was a recent statement by some of the kind of officials in the EU that we're going to become a regulatory superpower. Personally, I think that's a terrible idea, honestly. In other words, if your goal is to be more and more, put more and more regulation, what's going to happen, and what is happening already, is companies are not going to bring their products into your healthcare system. You look at as a global company, you think about what markets you're going to go into, and you're deciding, do I go into that healthcare system, in part based upon the complexity of getting it through. The U.S., I think, is a completely dysfunctional healthcare system. It can get better, but there is no fully functional healthcare system on the planet. And in Europe, the challenge is if it's a lot harder to get products onto the market, then products will not go on the market. They just will not have access to some of the latest technology in healthcare. I would love to see something which is more of like a harmonization, because with the product I built, I shouldn't have to go into every single country and do an accuracy diagnostic performance trial in every single country that I go into. I shouldn't have to go in there and prove all of the economic benefit, because it's just impossible to introduce new products into healthcare when there's so much burden and overhead. If we could think of more of a harmonization from a regulatory perspective, maybe legal perspective, other things like that, I think it would be tremendously beneficial, to everybody. It should be easier. HeartFlow's in almost every major hospital in the United States. But there's a lot of other geographies, patients in a lot of other parts of the world that don't have access to it, in part because of some of the barriers that companies face trying to bring them in.
Thank you. Thank you both. Been very insightful. Want to open it up to questions. Looks like we got one ready to go.
First, I really appreciate your human in the loop. Yeah, first I want to say I really appreciate the human in the loop comment, and I'm assuming you meant to use jargon, reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is really to train the models. Let me start with this. Well, especially with the assassination last year of the CEO of United Healthcare, there were denies in the media, and everyone seems to know what it means now. So my question is, I'm going to have to read this. The Texas Medical Association prior authorization reform is one of TMA's top priorities for legislation session. And my question is really around this. Senate Bill 815, I'm just going to read this real quick, to require health plans to approve patient care and verify coverage in a timely manner, and this is the part I want to emphasize, to prohibit health plans from using fully automated systems to deny care. Do you agree with this, and why?
Yes, I actually do. And I think, look, there's back to my earlier point, right? If decisions were easy to be made without a lot of probabilistic decision making, we've already done that, right? We've done that at the point of care. We've done that with rule-based systems and so forth. Using automated, I think it's a little strong language to the way it is. And by the way, nobody in the United States in the healthcare insurance space denies automatically today, because of that, that particular law that was passed, even before the law was passed, because of the public outlash and stuff, right? I want to offer a slightly contrarian perspective here, right? Yes, health plans have incentives to deny or delay because they make money on the float. They actually have to manage utilization on their population and stuff. But the statistics of denying an authorization that should have been approved, 50% of all denials get appealed, and when it gets appealed, you process 2 or 3 times the administrative overhead that you have to do if you're just approved in the first thing. So the cost factor is not the primary reason they actually deny this. I mean, that's one misconception that I feel. I mean, it was the case earlier and stuff like that. The bigger reason is actually more around the coordination of care. I'll give you two simple examples. Durable medical equipment, like wheelchairs, stretches, all of that kind of stuff, or like any of that stuff. The number of authorizations that get approved, which gets baked into your risk adjustment system, the cost of care models and stuff, that don't get fulfilled by the patient because they don't go and pick it up, they don't get the thing ordered, or it doesn't really get coordinated with the provider. There is so much of wasted dollars that actually happens when some things like that happen, right? So there's a lot of different reasons this prior auth as a process. I am not a fan of it. I can tell you, I actually fundamentally believe it should not exist, right? But the reasons and the motivations to actually do that is going to be, the bigger question is, can you empower the caregiver, can you empower the point of care, the person who's delivering care, the doctor, or the physician or the nurse practitioner who's delivering care, can you empower them with the right information that actually matches more like, hey, what kind of administrative thing that you have to take care of for auditability and compliance perspective, what kind of evidence-based medicine that you should actually be looking for before you actually approve or deny it, and make them, like take away the denial process, but push that decision-making with information, content, and context down to the point of care. The problem today is the incentives, right? It's the fact that you have the payer versus provider system. Providers primarily get paid for fee-for-service, so they're trying to get through this and go through that process. And the payers are like, I'm going to try to go to this. I do see some hope in value-based care, the whole model of actually having the, there's an economist comment, I can't remember who, but they were like, you show me a model and I'll tell you what the incentives are, or the other way. So you will have some, it's not perfect again, a value-based care system, but sharing that risk off the cost of care with the provider goes one step further on this. So, I mean, I gave you a non-answer answer, but, prior auth is like, I don't think it should be denied automatically either, right? Because what we know today and how the system is set up, should that be empowered and pushed back to the point of care? I actually absolutely think it should be.
I guess my follow-up question would be, one more question. No, sir, I just want to, I want an answer to this. So, to use the analogy, I'll be real quick, I promise. To use the analogy of driverless cars, right, level 2 autonomy, you just made the comment, humans, 50% accuracy, right? So in that case, why would you not allow the automated?
Well,
I think, again, this comes back to trust. I think that there could be circumstances where if you got to prove, be able to say, okay, now you have an automated algorithm that's doing it. And if you find over time that it's actually producing the right decision a very high percentage of the time, then I think there are decisions like that could be, fully automated. But I think that we're in a transition period right now where I think we have to have a little bit of caution. I think there's rightly there is concern about this world that we could live in where there is no doctor making a decision about whether this gets, approved or not. And I do think, by the way, I'm not completely against the whole point about radiology benefit managers and prior authorization, because I see the other side of it. In a fee-for-service healthcare system, what do you suppose is going to happen, right? When you pay people to do services, there's a vast amount of unnecessary procedures that are being done. And I'll give you one example. I'm going to give you a quick example. And this just really frosted me. I won't talk about where, but it's somewhere in the state of Texas. I visited a hospital and I talked about we could reduce invasive cardiac catheterization. This is better for patients. And the physician said, not interested, I have to pay my mortgage. And he said, and I thought, so you're viewing these tests as a revenue stream, not as what's best for the patient. Fortunately, I went to a hospital across the street, often heart hospitals right across the street from one another. I talked to a physician, he said, I don't know how we'll figure out navigating the reimbursement, but if it's good for patients, we'll do it. And most physicians are like that, but the truth of the matter is there's a lot of, in every profession, there's a lot of stuff going on in the United States that is absolutely purely for financial gain. And by the way, it's not always the physicians, it's often the providers as well. There's pressure from the service line administrators, like we got to go drive revenue, And there's a lot of sometimes too much focus on the revenue versus the quality of care. So it's a system that is fundamentally broken, in my opinion. There's a lot of room to reform it, and I do think some of these technologies we're talking about could help.
One more question.
Yeah.
Let's go with.
Hi. As someone who started their career at the FDA, I just want to step on my soapbox for a moment. So I'm disgusted by what's happening right now and by the number of individuals that have been impacted by the RIF. And I can say, being on the inside, that I hear a lot of what's, the perceptions of the FDA, right? A lot of bureaucratic red tape, really shady dealings and shady business, right? And people who aren't invested in the science. And that just isn't the case. And as someone who was a pre-market reviewer in CDRH and worked in CVD, I can say that we always were ahead of the 8 ball, and we're taking steps to understand the science and the technology, that they have facilities there at the agency that are invested in understanding the science so that we can be better partners with industry. I've since come over to the industry side, and I'm now a regulatory affairs consultant, and I work with a lot of companies in the digital health and health space. And so as someone who's worked on the sponsor side and helped companies get market clearances and authorizations, a daily struggle that I have right now is with respect to how it's not just about, like you said, Charlie, not just getting the market clearance, but really understanding the other hurdles, i.e. the reimbursement strategy and pathway. So I'm just curious, Charlie, you received your clearance some 10 years ago, and I'm interested in hearing about how you navigated understanding sort of the reimbursement challenges and the reimbursement strategy 10 years ago, and how you're seeing that now. Has there been improvement? Are there gaps? I assume yes, there are. And what do you think is the best way? I know there's a lot of talk about mechanisms to, start the process early and to bring CMS into the conversation as early as possible. But right now, to me anyway, from my perspective, it's all kind of just nebulous. What are some viable pathways?
Well, I think so. First of all, thank you for thank you for your service at the FDA. It's an incredible organization, and it honestly terrifies me right now to see what's going on and the possible consequence to healthcare in this country if it gets kind of systematically dismantled. I'm very worried about that. But I would say from the problem that we have, though, is you bring a product through, you get regulatory clearance, you go through that process, and I felt like we went through a very collaborative relationship with the FDA. There were some hurdles along the way. There was some crazy stuff that happened that, it's a longer story, but took Congress involvement to resolve some of the issues between the drug and the devices division at the FDA years ago. But there were some difficulties, but I would say that I found it to be a very collaborative process. The problem is you end that, and now you got to go out and navigate the healthcare payment systems and the reimbursement. Here's the issue. Hartflow was 15 years from the time that I raised the first financing. Now $900 million of capital later, it's still privately traded. It's doing great. It survived. But most companies don't survive that window of time. And I will promise you that no investor would have invested a dime into that company if they knew it would still be private 15 years later. And the issue is that there's a lot of opportunities for investment. If we can't figure this out, we will not get investors in healthcare. And we will not get new innovation in healthcare if we don't figure this out. So I don't have a solution, but I know there are a lot of people working on it to try to parallel path this to a degree. I have a really positive experience in the UK with going through that process with the National Institute of Care Excellence. And my product that I created is actually required that NHS hospitals it's part of a MedTech funding mandate. The hospitals are required to offer this to patients in England. And that was a whole different level of, issues. It'll be an interesting conversation, but I think that we need to figure this out. Otherwise, we will not get products into healthcare, and investors will go somewhere else. They'll make a quick buck on a whole bunch of other things.
All right, I think that's it for the questions. Any final words before we wrap up?
I think I've said enough. I'm going to turn over.
I think it takes a village, right? We're in a really awesome time in human history where technology is where it wasn't even 2 years ago, right? And we have the tools in our disposal. We have the empowerment from the God of technology. I think it's the education, the engagement, the alignment that we need to actually go make sure. Like, talk to everybody about it. You're going to the doctor, talk to them about it. I think, I'm a huge One Medical fan, so I personally, picked that thing. I look forward to those conversations because it's very informed conversation on both sides. I send my provider, my physician, a note about, hey, here's a few things that I actually wanted to check whether I should include this in my lifestyle, supplementation, longevity test, whatever the top of mind for me. And I send it ahead of time, and it's almost like going into a really highly functional corporate meeting where you go in and you sit down and have a very meaningful conversation for 30 minutes because they're informed, I'm informed, and we have this. And I think it's like the technology is the means, not the end. It's still that parties that we need to bring in to go make this happen. So I think, just engage if you're, I'm sure this means that you're already engaged in this journey. Engage others who are not part of the journey. And it takes a village to get to our full potential. Great. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for your time today. I know it was very helpful for me.
Yeah, but that's fine. Because, I mean, like, I've had if I didn't have one,